Bovine Banter with the Penn State Extension Dairy Team. I'm Emily Fread, and I'm a dairy educator based in Union County, Pennsylvania. Our team has been working on developing biosecurity plans for dairies throughout the state in preparation for HPAI. If there's a dairy outbreak in PA, farms will be required to have a biosecurity plan to ship milk. So if you haven't done yours yet, please reach out to us. Joining us today is J. Craig Williams, a dairy educator based out of Tioga County, who has a specialty in dairy risk management and has been subcontracting with the USDA to help deal with HPAI in poultry. He spent 2 weeks in December in California and has been on the front lines with the recent outbreak here in PA. Today, we will be interviewing Colin Kadis from EverAg about the changes in the market and how they relate to HPAI. We invited Colin onto our podcast today because 1 year ago, Craig was listening to the EverAg podcast and realized something might be happening in Texas. Colin reported a year ago that milk production was down in Texas for an unknown reason.
Hello, Emily, and welcome back, everybody, to the Bovine Banter. And I want to welcome Colin. Welcome to our show today, Colin.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me.
Kick it off. I just want to see, do you remember that podcast you guys were doing a year ago? And talk about that a second, and then go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I remember it well. And actually, ironically, one of the things I remember, I was in state college for a Pennsylvania Dairy Conference, and there was a speaker on, contamination and biosecurity. And I remember laughing and saying, who cares? Cows are strong creatures. We're all good. And here we are. And, I think the jury is kind of determined I was wrong. It does matter, and we should have paid attention. And we should still pay attention. At that time, I think we had no idea what the heck was going on. We just knew the cows were losing milk in Texas and New Mexico. A lot of people thought it might be winter dysentery. Texted basically everyone I knew asking if they had heard. We had, Idaho actually shut down its state borders to cattle, and they still unfortunately got it. And now we know that it's avian influenza. So we've come a long way.
Let me circle back to that. The way I remember it is you had the podcast, and it was the last 20 minutes, and somebody said, there's something going on in Texas, milk production's down. And I reached out to you guys to get a transcript of what you heard and then repeated it to my state vets. And I said, reach out to your peers. And they're like, okay, yeah, we will. And then it was like 4 days later, it was confirmed there is definitely something going on. It wasn't just a he said type of deal. And then we moved from March to July. A group of us were in Texas for a national meeting, and we started touring a couple farms. Only one dairy was on the tour. And that guy starts telling his experience from early March, late February, early March. And we're like, this is really kind of the hot zone where this happened. And then, of course, now I spent some time in California here in December. And now California's obviously had the worst of it and is over, 800 herds and all. Colin, why don't you introduce yourself and EverAg? Tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll work into how do we see this happening in the market. And along with that, understand we are 1 year from where we were in March, and this has really been a nationwide issue. So we're still only 1 year. So we have to preference it around that. So
it's not done. Well, I hope it's done. We'll see what's going on. Maybe it's not done yet. But yeah, I'm Colin Kadis. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. Developed a passion for animals very early on. Decided I wanted to be a dairyman and not a horse racing trainer. Went to school in New York. I actually, when there was a human pandemic, I have a friend who milks cows in central PA. Spent my, kind of the pandemic there, and transitioned into a role after school with EverAg. EverAg is a company that's gone by a lot of names. Initially, Dairy.com, Rice Dairy, Commodity Risk Management Group, Blimling, but they've kind of done a really nice job of bringing together a lot of subject matter experts, including some that live in PA. And I think at the end of the day, basically do everything from the back end of how milk checks are calculated for co-ops to hedging risk for producers, grain producers, dairy producers, and even cooperatives, and do market research as well. So we're trying very hard to be a master of many trades and not a master of none, jack of all,
What's the office saying about HPAI and at EverAg, and then we'll work into the charts and talk about, year over year charts, things like that. But what's the office's discussion right now?
On kind of where things are right now at this.
Yeah. Yeah, and EverAg's position or how you guys are.
I think at least for the first wave of bird flu in the kind of major states, we've seen almost all the major states get it. I mean, there are notable exceptions, but in terms of the West, and the West seems to have had a worse time of bird flu than the East. We did see cases in Michigan, and I'm not saying it was easy for those dairymen, but Michigan never saw the huge impact we saw maybe in a state like Idaho, Texas, New Mexico, or certainly California, which kind of got it at the end of the summer, maybe when the cows were at their most vulnerable. So there does seem to be some kind of discrepancy between how cows react to avian influenza on the East or upper Midwest than the West, at least for now. So I think if that changed, that's one thing our ear is definitely to the ground on. Wisconsin is a state that, at least at this point, we haven't really seen cases or at least an impact from avian influenza that we can identify. And so, given that they are the second largest milk producing state and a huge cheese market, that would have a huge impact on class 3 prices. Washington we haven't seen huge impacts. The Northeast and I'd say the Southeast, we haven't seen huge impacts. And I guess I should also say, I think Arizona is kind of going through it, but it sounds like, at least from where California and maybe even Idaho are at, maybe the symptoms are possibly getting maybe a smaller impact. Is that seasonal, or is that the disease itself? Hard to know. So maybe there's a second course. Who knows what happens if either first lax or maybe second lax start to show impacts that it sounded like heifers didn't show impacts last time. Maybe we see some of these signs, but I think at least for now, we're cautiously optimistic that bird flu or avian influenza will not have a huge impact on the West, which is really what's moved prices. But we have an ear to the ground on Wisconsin.
Let's jump into charts a second. Do you have some year over year data, and do we see a difference there, or is it just? I understand California, we're just over 800 herds. The big four is Colorado, Idaho, and then Michigan after that. And even Texas, where it started, is only in the 27 some herds. But understandably, a large herd produces a lot more milk than, say, the smaller herds we have in some of our other states. So nationwide, though, have we seen this change in the milk over year charts?
We definitely have, no question. And I think we saw the influenza spread. There was always kind of that question of what are the reporting requirements, because those have developed too. California, very stringent. I think at this point, we're still waiting for a real ramp up of reporting in the upper Midwest. So maybe there were cases we didn't know about, et cetera. But whether kind of despite the case count in some of these places, generally we would see it felt like maybe for 3 to 4 months, a state would be about -1 or -2% at their peak year over year on milk production. And that was really what we were expecting going into California. And boy, were we naive, because the worst we thought it could be was -4%. And California came in at, a little higher than -8%, which there's been some revisions to these numbers. But it's definitely true that we're seeing the impact of avian influenza in milk production year over year. And that's basically been more pronounced in California than anywhere, just basically twice the impact of any other state.
Yeah, I talked to one dairyman in California, and he did say that there was a definite difference between the cows, the herds that got it in the summer and the herds that got it in the fall.
Yeah.
They didn't suffer they still suffered, but they didn't have the same symptoms as their neighbors a few months earlier. I'm not sure how that's going to end up affecting us across the whole country, but he said fall, when he got infected in the fall, that was not as serious as his neighbors had experienced when they were a summer infection. So, and then I guess the big question we have, and see what you guys say in the marketing department, is, well, what about these cows when they come back, or the next lactation? We really don't know that yet because we're still 1 year into this.
110%. And, it just goes so deep, right? I think people reported higher abortions. So it's hard to know, were they milking cows, some of those cows early, or if they were early abortions, has that thrown off preg rates? I'm sure conception was down as well, sick cows. So, yeah, there's a lot to be seen. I mean, I think the one tangible thing we definitely are seeing and hearing is that just the butterfat values in milk are incredibly high. And I think some of that is we've had really high, farmers have been paid a lot for their butterfat recently. So it made sense to pay and put things like palm fat into rations. But I think a lot of that too is probably that we're milking a lot more older cows. And maybe it's possible that avian influenza is also having some impact on milk composition. But it makes sense that as people cull more cows and there are less heifers to throw into the herd, culling because of bird flu, you milk some older cows and have higher components.
Have you seen an impact on cow numbers because of the bird flu? Are people culling more cows?
I think that's a great question, and I think we definitely have. The nice thing I would say for dairy producers is that beef prices are really high. So it wasn't, if we were at historical lows, I think maybe more cows would have got a chance. And that is one thing I think we did see develop is initially guys would cull every cow. It felt like that didn't look great because what would happen is a cow would get sick, and for most of them, some of them would make basically no milk for 2 days. And so if the beef truck showed up that day and the guy needed to fill a pot load at record beef prices, he says, okay, I'm sending her. I think people then realized that some of the cows do come back and slowed that process down. And maybe the culling wasn't as severe, but I would just say generally, we definitely saw increased culling as a result of bird flu. And it was at a time that most people did not want to be culling cows, even though beef prices were high, because they probably didn't have a load of replacements as a result of breeding to more beef on dairy and replacement prices being high kind of as a result of high beef prices. So it's definitely put a squeeze on dairymen, I would say.
Is there anything EverAg's doing in their reports? I mean, you guys have a great portfolio of charts and all of that. Is there something that's going to have to change in those charts because of bird flu? And I'm just thinking outside the box, like we're going to see a different chart from you for a couple 2 years or so. You guys talk that through. How are you going to handle that?
It's a great question. We've got a really talented insights crew. I'd say one thing that they're really pushing, the USDA still reports milk production in fluid pounds. And that's at times misleading because milk production could be up 0% year over year. And then components could be up enough that milk production effectively was up 1%. I mean, the rate that we're
Wow.
component in the milk supply is insane. So I think that's one big change we made this year is we need to accurately report basically ECM milk, energy corrected milk, because that's what producers in most federal orders get paid for is the components they produce. And then I think to your point going forward, the year over year comparisons are going to be a little bit funky. And that's usually what we run and the market runs off of. If we think that milk production was maybe a little bit too low because of bird flu versus normal, maybe this year things will be a little bit higher artificially. So I think it goes both ways, but probably the best way to do it is just attach an asterisk and remind people of some of these things, which happens all the time with leap years, etc. And we actually saw that in February, where milk production is actually growing already versus last year and is up 1% for the first time in 24 months. So it's happening already.
Colin, what's the story on milk price then? And of course, every dairyman wants to know what it's going to do. I come from the background of everybody should buy DMC, or at least the producers that we have. And they're like, well, milk price is going to be up. I shouldn't buy it. And I'm like, no, that's not the direction you want to go. But from when you talking to your producers and being in the broker's seat, what's your thoughts this year?
The big story this year is a little bit similar to last year, just in terms of how much processing capacity we have hitting the market at one time. And we've been talking about this for 2 years because it often takes 2 years to actually build a plant, sometimes longer. So I think we are seeing that, especially cheese capacity ramp up. And the big question have kind of been twofold. One, do we have enough milk to fill these new plants? Because if we do, then we're going to make a lot of new product. And number two is if we do fill them, how do we get rid of all that product? Can we export enough of it? I think it is kind of tough on our end, to answer the first question, do we have enough milk? We are seeing milk production come back really strong. I mean, up 1% in February was strongest we've seen in a long time and not really a surprise to our group. So I know there's a lot of rhetoric about expensive heifers and avian influenza, and we have to keep watching that. Don't get me wrong, but I think it should be said, it seems like the milk is coming. And number two, can we export this product? Because we probably are going to make more than we can kind of consume domestically. That's going to be a kind of an uphill battle. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric about tariffs from the executive office. Tariffs are not helpful to getting more exports off. They basically make it so our prices have to go even lower to be competitive. So it'll be an interesting year. I mean, prices have already come off now. I think the hope is that we kind of get some low cheese prices, become attractive to the rest of the world, which is way higher on an export basis. They'll realize that we're the deal, buy our cheese, and bring our prices higher. So hopefully it's through exports and not a continuation of avian influenza that we see higher prices to round out the year.
Let's jump back to that heifer story a second. Any new news on heifers? And I mean, you referenced the rumor about high price heifers, and of course we know baby calves that are black with black heads are going for a premium. So what's your thoughts on the heifer price, calf price?
It's a tough market because there's not a lot of great data. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who try really hard to give us good information, but kind of all the information we have is what the price is. So I definitely think it's true that we're not hearing anyone say, man, there's so many heifers out there, I get to pick whichever one I want. That's not a story we're hearing, but I think it's also not fair to go to the other side and say, there's no heifers, I can't fill my barn, therefore I'm not making any milk. I think if you ask most producers, they're probably making just as much milk, if not more, through the bulk tank as they were last year. So I think maybe the way that I try to keep numbers sane is if you think about a heifer's value, which at this point, a fresh heifer could be anywhere from 3,600 to pushing and higher than $4,000. There's kind of a historical relationship where you can generally buy one fresh heifer and sell two cull cows. And that relationship is still intact. I mean, there's guys getting $1,900, $1,800, $2,000 for their cull cows. I think it's worth saying at least that maybe heifer price isn't so much related to heifer availability or maybe even related to milk price. I'm sure those are factors, but I think the biggest factor is the beef price. So as long as the beef price stays high, her beef value is just going to keep that price inflated. So then it's a question of how long do we keep the beef price high? You'll have to ask someone else. I don't know much about beef, but we are at record highs, so it goes up generally does come down eventually. So we'll see. But that's what I would watch is beef price to understand where heifer prices are going.
So a quick summary there then. Milk's been up 1% for the year in February. The nationwide avian flu, kind of the 1 year anniversaries here, March, April. So we kind of got 2 more months to kind of see yet. Not into the heat yet. We're not sure about the export situation. And you feel that presently there's enough milk to get these new plants going.
Yeah, I would say so. And if you look at the futures curve for January and February, I was maybe surprised at how strong the price was, which is great. I always like when I'm surprised and it's higher. I think producers probably just last week, well, I guess I should timestamp this, right? Producers in February are going to see that prices were at about $20. I think when we look at March, and I guess the timestamp will prove me right or wrong, those prices are probably going to be a lot closer to 18. And April hopefully will be 18. We might even be lower. So this is the time of year. It's the spring doldrums. It's a time when we usually have more milk production than we do have demand for dairy. So it's not surprising prices are low now. The question really, I think, at this point is how low will they go in the spring and how long will it take to kind of balance markets back up and get to good prices again, hopefully in Q3 or Q4.
I think this has been great. And I think we're in this really weird time of the disease outbreak that I'm not sure we fully know nationwide. And understandably, we've had a lot of large herds been affected, so it can affect our milk numbers pretty dramatically quick. And I think Colin's right on cue. We got to look at the numbers and see what they're telling us.
And if it's interesting too, Europe is kind of tracking with a similar issue, which is blue tongue disease. And blue tongue usually has maybe its most pronounced impact in the summer. So that's kept European prices way higher than ours and kind of creates that export opportunity for our product. It'll be interesting. One of our slides on this month's kind of dairy situation and outlook was disease. not something we're used to seeing. So it's definitely true that some of these things that we learned for our animal science degrees are coming back, and no matter what your job, becoming very useful.
Tell us how farmers and other county agents can log on to your information or your other podcasts, and we can kind of go from there as a wrap up and how we can be involved with EverAg.
We're always happy to support producers anywhere. We've kind of got two people who focus on the Northeast, Bryce Windecker and Kathleen Wolfley. And they're actually both often on a podcast on Spotify called, well, they've got a lot of them, but a great one is Parlor to Plate. And then we feel like we give out pretty good information. Our weekly call that's hosted by Matt Gould. Matt's actually based out of Western New York, so he's somewhat homegrown. And the only stipulation with that call is we feel like we give out such good information that we try to reserve it only for people who are using EverAg services in some way, generally. So if you're interested on that side, you can either reach out to me, which is clk@ever.ag, or come through on the company website, etc. And we're happy to help anyone.
Great, thank you. Do you have any last minute take home messages or advice for our audience?
Well, I guess the first one is probably we should probably be taking biosecurity a little bit more. We should be more careful. I mean, it is really frustrating because we're not like other industries that have done so much more preparation. We don't have the same facilities. I mean, it feels like a tough haul, but I think we got a little lucky that bird flu only reduces milk production and largely doesn't actually kill animals. I think the other one too, milk pricing kind of only gets more volatile when we do see these impacts of bird flu, etc., blue tongue, sports tariffs. So I know it seems like no one gets into dairying because they want to spend a lot of time looking at markets or learning about risk management, and I can't blame them. But I do think it's good to have at least a plan in place for when these things happen and say, okay, here's our production, here's our utilization between class 3 and 4, here's how we would hedge our milk if we wanted to, here's our cost of production, etc. So having some kind of plan for when these things offer opportunities or maybe risks is always good. And we got lucky that this one so far has largely been an opportunity on the milk price side.
Well, Colin, I'll thank you. And I'll tell you, nobody ever complains about a clean truck or clean boots. So, that biosecurity is true. We all need to make sure we got clean boots on. And I'll thank you for your time. I'll turn it back over to Emily, and we'll be happy to talk to you guys again anytime.
Thank you, Colin, for joining us today, and thanks to all of our listeners. If anyone needs more information about this topic, feel free to reach out to Colin, or you can email me at evf5337@psu.edu. Thank you.